Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and this poorly lit and badly built, sorry excuse for a model tank, is the Panzer III I built at the Warlord Games Open Day a couple of weeks back. It was a really fun day overall and a cool activity to round it off. We were given a model tank, each table got a poly cement and some clippers, and we got stuck in. The two main reasons why my tank looks so terrible is, one, there was limited space, and so I got to the point where I could hold up and shout, "I'm done, good enough," and then I could leave a space for someone else who was waiting for their turn. And B, I was the only one at our table building a Panzer III, and so we had a Sherman instruction sheet, and if I brought it back home, I'd have a better chance of putting it together properly. I did bring back all the sprues. The first one mainly has the tracks and skirtsen, and the other has a whole heap of tiny parts, and I've no idea what any of these are. Thankfully, having built a few Warlord Games vehicles before, I have a decent chance of putting the tracks together while I'm looking out for those instructions. I started pulling the parts off of the sprue and cleaning away the worst of the mould lines. There'll be plenty of those over this kit, so I'm not making them perfect at this stage. The drive sprocket is usually a good one to get started with. Sometimes these can come in several parts, but usually, and in this example, it's just a single piece. In a sign of a good model kit, this piece has two pegs to act as keying to align the part, and the left and right sides have the pegs slightly differently spaced, and each one has a larger and a smaller peg. This makes it really easy to work out not just which side, but which way round they should go as well. The track sections are also easy to figure out if you're paying attention. The long flat sections go against the ground, and the slightly wiggly long sections go on top, as if gravity is drooping them over the return rollers. Whilst I couldn't figure out exactly where the differences are, the top pieces are different for the left and right. One way they fit well, and one way they don't, so use the way that fits well. I just put a tiny bit of poly cement to tack these in place while I sort the other pieces out. I'll probably have to nudge them around, and so that makes it all easier to line up. The rounded sections are also all distinct, front, back, left, right, each one fits only in one place, and this does help ensure that the radius around each wheel is correct and the tracks are all pointed in the same way. The keying on these also does help with positioning the tracks in the sideways direction, but you do have to push the keying all of the way in as it is a straight peg from the side. Once I got to putting on the bottom section, again these are slightly different for each side, I had to hold them quite tightly to ensure that the road wheels would adhere to the tracks, which did shift the other parts of the tracks around slightly. Thankfully I was working quickly and all the poly cement was still wet, and all the parts could shift around and settle into the right place. Well, with all that sorted, I'll build the other side, and whilst I do that I'll talk about my choice of vehicle. At the Build a Tank event there were 4 choices of tank, but we weren't told this in advance, and so before the day I went on a little bit of a self-indulgent wander through Warlord Games website to every single one of the tank kits. And naturally I would much prefer an armoured car. I quite like armoured cars. But of the tanks, there are still some weird looking things. The M3 Stuart is kinda dorky, and the Char-1B is quite out of place in World War II. And there's of course the classic Comet or Churchill from the British. Well, I came up with a short list, and top of that list would be the M10 Wolverine for my American force because I stole their Sherman for my British. My second choice was the Panzer III, however, a German light-ish, medium-ish tank that's just the right size for bolt action, a game where you generally just play with a few infantry squads and one vehicle. The 4 choices on the day were T-34, my Kazakhs have one of those already, and the Sherman, which I mentioned my British stole theirs. The other 2 were the Panzer III and the Tiger. Now the Tiger's a big old tank, a little too big for the smaller games that I like to play of bolt action, and so my second choice on my list, and one that was available, gives me a perfect start on my 4th bolt action army. Perfect. My friend, who's a Japanese player, wasn't as impressed. Equally unimpressed is me, or I was when I looked over the tiny parts that I had to figure out. Unlike the tracks, which are very similar to the way that other tracks go together in other model kits, these are kind of specific to this tank, and I'll need to look up some information about it. Google Images was helpful somewhat. There are many photos and artist impressions of various angles of the vehicle, but it was really Herbert Erpedup's video who was the most use. He made a video on the Italeri Panzer III, which just happens to be the exact same sprues because Italeri makes some or most of Warlord's tanks. Or they used to. I'm not exactly sure how that works behind the scenes. But with Herbert's video as help, I started putting the rear end of the tank together, and in payment I have to talk about how this will be doing sick jumps in the future. The mounting for the exhaust has to be cut out from the inside, but sensible as I am, I only tacked the hull pieces together at the open day, as I suspected I might need to open it back up at some point. Brutally stabbing through the recessed guides was easy, and I got the exhaust lined up nicely. With the upper hull separate, it'll be easy to attach all of the various tiny bits, like the jack, which looks very jack, and the fire extinguisher, which looks very handy, probably used for extinguishing fires. You're supposed to cut out the second peg hole for the fire extinguisher, but I just cut off the peg instead, as I have faith in poly cement for such a small part. Glue for the glue god and all that. Another part that I only tacked in place was the turret armour panels, as I would like to spend a little bit of extra time to ensure that they line up properly and seal up and not leave any gaps. Turns out I only had to remove the rear piece, and I flooded the joining edge with poly cement so that when I replaced it and held it down with lots of pressure, the cement would squeeze out and set in this kind of line of bubbles. That squeeze out could then be shaved or sanded down once fully dry, and a nice smooth surface remains, reducing the amount of gap filling that would be required. The front of the turret is where I'm most embarrassed, as I put this together totally incorrectly. But in my defense, I was in a hurry and also had not the instructions. The gun barrel I had in this place, it's actually the mounting point for the gun barrel, so I skipped that part entirely. And the outer section of armour is not something I like the look of, that's kind of the up-armoured version. With a photo of the instructions, I collected the correct components and put them all together, although I'm not entirely sure how the turret elevation is supposed to work, so that ended up being fixed in a neutral position. I added the correct barrel mounting piece and added plenty of cement to the front of the turret to mount that whole assembly, applying extra pressure with the flat blunt end of my knife so that it would squeeze out and look good once I'd sanded that down. In the instructions, these side panels for the turret are incorrectly numbered. Thankfully I noticed that the vision ports were a little strange, and I checked some images that I had looked up earlier, and so they went on correctly. I always liked having Tank Commander sticking up out of the top of a tank. It adds the option of painting a part of the model in some different colours, and it just looks more interesting than the hatch button down. The included one is fine and all, but I did get the Tiger Tank Commander from my friend. Rather than the questionable raised hand, I positioned his right arm resting down on the open hatch, and I cut some scrap plastic to make a peg for the internals of the hatch. It's strange how neither of the Commander models have a peg, where both of the turrets do have a peg hole. Unfortunately, when I got to cleaning the mould lines, I ended up shaving off his pinky, which would be fine for a battle injury, but I decided to use a better quality hand from another kit. One last thing for the turret is the gun. Nice detail, there is some slide moulding, which means there's a third part to the mould so that barrels can have a bore. I think this is a totally unnecessary step at this scale, as a black dot painted on serves exactly the same purpose at this scale, but it's a nice inclusion for those who want this. I had originally fitted the longer barrel, but I kinda chewed this up when I put it into the wrong place. There's also a tiny stubby barrel, but I went with the mid-size version. I have not much of a clue when it comes to which one I should go for. I've not actually played with Germans in bolt action. This is my first model built. Thankfully, none of my local crowd really worry about the exact number of rivets on a model. As long as you use the right rules and the points values, everyone will be happy and still play. The last detail I added, mainly because I was avoiding them, are those utterly tiny pegs. I ain't got a clue what they're meant to be or why such a fragile part is included in a wargaming kit, but here they are. I guess I'll paint silver over the stumps when they inevitably break off. But there is my newest tank complete, the Warlord Games Artillery 1:56 scale Panzer III Ausführung something. I'm not actually sure what variant this would count as I'm not a panzer surgeon and I wasn't following the instructions all that well. I do know that there are a few armour panels and hatches left over for the bits box, mostly the skirts, and that I might try and fit as a removable option for this tank, possibly with some fancy magnets, but for now this one can be a light Axis tank to go up against my allied mediums. But now, with it properly built this time, I'll paint it in another video eventually, so I can just say, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.